I'd like to introduce our host and psychotherapist for their series, I Am Not Okay, Kim Christing. Kim is the founder and executive director of Bay Ridge Counseling Centers and Human Strong, which is part of the Bay Ridge Circle of Care. He is an author and creator of several mental health programs in the area of mood disorder and anger management. For several years, Kim hosted a call-in national talk show called Nightlight and has appeared on numerous national talk shows speaking to the issues of mental health and relationships. Over his 40-year career, Kim has intimately worked with thousands of individuals, couples, and families to help navigate the challenges of mental, emotional, and relational health. Please welcome Kim Christing.
Thank you, Amy. Today we're looking at areas of toxic aspects of maleness and masculinity. And our first guest is Anil Anand. And Anil has served as a police officer with the Canadian Police Service for 29 years, with assignments as a frontline officer, an undercover narcotics officer, and intelligence officer. He has worked in professional standards and business intelligence, corporate communications, the Ipperwash inquiry, and has been assigned to Interpol. He has worked on cases ranging from routine street-level investigations to cases involving international organized crime, and has been involved with the extradition of accused persons from the United States, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Anil holds a degree in physical and health education from the University of Toronto, a Master's of Law degree from Osgoode Hall Law School, an MBA from the Rotman School of Management, and an Executive MBA from the University of St. Gallen, just to name a little bit of his academic endeavors. Anil published a book called Mending Broken Fences Policing, a book on contemporary policing, the role of policing in modern society, and its relationship to the diverse communities represented in a postmodern world. He presented papers at the Southern Criminal Justice Association in Savannah, Georgia, and at the Conference for Sustainable Leadership in Bangkok, Thailand. Our second guest is Randy Scott. Randy Scott is an author, speaker, mentor, and the founder of Zen Empowerment. With a degree in marketing, Randy spent a 25-year corporate career in international sales and marketing while living in US, Europe, and in Asia. After nearly dying in a motorcycle accident at the age of 33, he realized that he had a second chance to live. So he went in search of what really mattered in his life. His passion for the fusion of science and spirituality led him to compile the principles and tools of Zen Empowerment. He's found a way to enjoy more peace, power, and purpose in life, as well as discover authenticity by uncovering who we are not in order to find who we really are. Today, Randy is an executive mentor, speaker, and author. He does individual and group mentoring as well as speaking on topics such as emotional intelligence, mindfulness, neural reprogramming, and standing in your power. Welcome, gentlemen, and we want to look at I Am Not Okay, men behaving badly. Today, masculinity is difficult to define, but more difficult to achieve and perhaps impossible to maintain. Certainly, the status quo has been challenged, especially when we see undeniable exposure of the abuse of power in stories such as George Floyd, an African-American man who was murdered by a police officer in Minneapolis over a counterfeit $20 bill. Or we see the massive exposure of abuse by the Me Too movement, or our unmarked graves in our own country, in our residential schools, or the mistreatment of First Nations people, certainly racial targeting, or the mistreatment of our own seniors at times, or the sexual misconduct in our military. Not to mention in our own government, there are so many proverbial sacrificial lambs on the chopping block protecting the power brokers that the country's production of lamb has surpassed New Zealand for the first time. I'm joking. However, when a 17-year-old girl's voice has successfully called out a billionaire and a British prince, we get it. Things are changing for men. We all hear it. There's a rising roar of women's voices that are saying men behaving badly is not okay. Perhaps our sins are finding us out. So, gentlemen, the first thing I want to throw out into the ring here today is have men, do you think, always behaved badly? I think they have, but has it increased, do you think, to any degree? Thoughts?
Well, it's interesting when I'm watching some of the older shows on television, and we have these warnings beforehand, or these qualifications beforehand about how the representations are inappropriate today, but they are a reflection of what took place at the time.
Right.
And what we are now seeing as adults, as where we are today, when reflecting back as having been wrong behavior, was perfectly acceptable behavior back then. In fact, even if women didn't conform to that notion of feminism, which was male imposed, in some of those older shows, you see that the representation was of those women being ousted by the other women. I mean, if a woman showed up, at a medieval, at a 18th century party wearing pants and a jacket, that would have been seen as an outrageous thing to do, right?
So our definition of behaving badly, has it changed?
I believe it has. I mean, we're going through a shift. This society has been very much a patriarchal society, and that is changing. And as we're seeing these changes, it goes back to what Anil says. The things that were acceptable before are not acceptable today. And then I think with the advent of social media and things like that, it's just highlighted and much, much more visible than it ever has been in the past.
And how do you feel men are responding to that?
It's interesting. We get to adapt, right? I very much honor the feminine, and for example, when I coach women CEOs that do not have to be masculine to be this powerful CEO. I love that. I've got a few friends that are in their feminine, they're CEOs, they're very successful. And for me, it's a beautiful thing to see. What I do believe is that, I mean, think about how as humans, how have we learned masculinity, femininity, and everything else? We didn't go to university to learn this.
Right.
So we've learned it all from previous generations, from family, from friends. And so what we're doing in general is repeating what we've learned. And as we move forward, those things get to change.
I agree completely. I think this whole notion of femininity and masculinity, and we're focusing on masculinity today, it's a socially prescribed construct that's been defined for us. Just as women spoke up against the harmful representation of really slim young models in magazines and on the runways as being unhealthy for women, men have been given a representation of what it meant to be masculine, whether it was Clint Eastwood or John Wayne or James Bond or Jason Bourne, that were also unhealthy. And we're now at a point where we're trying to examine the impact and the trauma that these false representations and images, expectations have caused.
And so do you think that our masculinity is being redefined, or it's being restored to what we lost?
Well, I think it's interesting because, we bring up, as a father, if I had a young son, do I teach that young son to survive in a world that he's going to be in, or do I teach him to be a good man? And by that I mean this. I mean, we teach our young boys to embrace trauma when they're young. We want them to play rugby and football and hockey and check hard and take MMA sports. That's the kind of thing we teach our boys, because that's the world they're going to be living in. And then we spend the rest of our lives trying to correct the trauma that kind of competitive, win at all costs, be a type A personality causes. And so we've got a world in which, we teach men either you've got to be type A or you got to pretend to be type A. And if you're pretending, or if you are, it leaves this residue of stuff that causes for that toxicity. I think that's part of that toxicity.
So the molds and the patterns and the teachings of our past is less to do with survival and more to do with being a good human. Is that what you're saying?
Well, we know a lot about what it means, bad masculinity means. We know we hear about a lot about that. But what is good masculinity?
Yeah.
What is
a great question.
Right.
Well, that's a great question. And we had this little discussion before we were on camera here, and even talking about leadership. And so I it's like the old book title, Who Moved the Cheese? And I'm saying, I thought leadership used to be about character and not just influence. In other words, when did it change that character was no longer required to get in high points of leadership, and it seemed that used to be the requirement, and that used to be the thing we would focus on. But something's changed, something shifted to a great degree. Yes, we have to own that we're part of a long history of men in power, but there's been, even the qualifications seem to have changed.
I think you're right. As we move forward, for me, any toxic behavior is something that stems from fear, right? Where we fear we're not good enough. We have fear of abandonment. We have fear of what other people think. And for me, whether it's masculine or feminine, toxic behavior stems from fear. And a lot of us, the vast majority of our programming happens by the age of 7. And so, if you think about single parent homes, if you think about lack of father figures, if you think about some of these things that are going on in society, a lot of the youth, a lot of the boys and men that are coming into society have not had those figures like they have in the past. And so they're looking at, like Anil was talking about with movies and things like that, they're looking at, oh, this is the way I'm supposed to behave. But if we look at any toxic behavior, most of the time that's coming from disempowering programming that we have as children, and it's just fear-based. And so to me, any toxic behavior comes from that. And it's like, okay, how do we help everybody to deal with themselves, to deal with their trauma, to deal, for so many years, men were told to to hide their emotions. And that is super unhealthy. So how do we shift ourselves, and how do we shift society to be able to just embrace and not come from this place of fear? Because really, it's coming from a place of love that answers and resolves the vast majority of what we're seeing today.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think that shift is become evident when we look at some of the leaders. When you look at Golda Meir, for example, or Margaret Thatcher, these were very powerful, very strong women, but they had a very strong sense of protectionism. They had very masculine characteristics in some senses. They came from a place of protection first. But if you look at women today, they don't have to rise through the ranks trying to meet a male-defined concept of what it means to be a leader. So Jacinda Ardern, for example, and I'm a big hero of hers, she brings a sense of ethic, a sense of care first over protection. She's more concerned about the care of her society and her people, and then protection. Whereas the male perspective was always protection first and then care second. Now that's very subtle, but women now can go through the ranks. I mean, I learned a very important lesson about the subtleties of this. I had said to my daughter, who's a young university student, that I was abhorred by what I read on the report about RCMP officers, the mistreatment of the female RCMP officer. And I said to her that I don't know how any man could treat somebody that has a wife, a mother, a sister, a daughter, in the way that these men treated their colleagues. And she stopped me and she said, "You know what, Dad, you're very wrong about how you put that. That's absolutely wrong." And it took me back for a minute. And she explained that, your concept of how you've put that is defined on the basis of a woman's relationship to a man, either as a wife, daughter, sister. A woman should be just a woman. And a very subtle difference, but it's a powerful, nuanced thing that as men we need to understand. Women, we don't have to judge or define the role of women based on their relationship to us, which is what we've tended to do.
That is interesting, and as well as with Randy, what you're saying is how do we be empowering men, and that's kind of where I assume we're going to end up reaching and ending this conversation. However, when we think about fear, and I remember I was talking to the very shocking video of George Floyd, and one of our senior psychologists, who happens to be from America and is used to that kind of policing, I guess. He had worked with many in the prison system in various areas in his own practice, but he says, as soon as I saw the police officer's response, immediately said, I will put $100 down that police officer has been traumatized sometime in his life. That kind of behavior, and as one other person says, that he's never seen the abuse of power not connected with some kind of neglect or abuse or the lack of, or being under-nurtured in childhood, as Randy has said. And so what we are really, which is really hard for me to say, I think, because I'm talking to myself, is that how many of us men are afraid? I mean, here we have all the power and we've had it for years, and we cannot, you cannot, in any ethical or any leadership fashion, kind of remove the responsibility for the misuse of our resources, our environment, how our women and our institutions and our economics have been by using aggression or force. And as we were saying, it is not for the care of, it's for the overcoming or to acquire or those kind of things. And men have been in leadership during these times, and the buck stops with us men. And so you and I, guys, are one of those. How does that feel?
You know what's interesting is I believe that with this shift that is going on, it's shaking us up. In the United States, if you look at the demographics of suicide, white males between 35 and 55 are the number one demographic for suicide. It's the 10th. It's the 10th cause of death. And if we think about that, it's like our world is being shaken up, and we get to shift and we get to change. And at the same time, what we're doing is we get to come into acceptance of our own emotions, our own self. We get to quit. We get to stop being fractured human beings, right? If you think about addiction and suicide, those are the primary reasons is to escape. And most of the time what we're doing is we're trying to escape ourselves, and there's no escaping ourselves. And so as we look at our shadow, as we look at accepting ourselves, then we can come to terms as a society and say, okay, if we can love ourselves as an individual, then we can come together as a society and resolve some of these things. But it really starts with the individual. There's no way we can fix society without fixing ourselves first.
I agree 100%. It goes back, I think, to your idea that all of this stuff is based in fear. We're afraid, I think, as men that have run these institutions, as you said, of first of all relinquishing power and not being in that position of control and influence. I think that's causes dissonance for men, and then having to live with this trauma of suck it up, you don't show any pain, you don't show any fear, and you move on. And this has resulted in, I think, wide scale PTSD in men. PTSD doesn't have to come from fighting a battle. There is this trauma that men have been harboring, and it's a form of PTSD that exhibits, as Randy has said, in suicides and substance abuse, in the number of homicides. I mean, 80% of homicides are perpetrated by men. Most victims are men. Our jails are full of men. People that are going and joining gangs are because they have poor role modeling of men. And now, men are not sure what masculinity means. And so we are kind of confused ourselves. Okay, we know what toxic masculinity is, but what's good masculinity? What does that mean? And so there's that on top of everything else, I think, that's affecting how we behave.
And then you see the argument of and the good men, not the good representation of humanity, circling the wagons, and you hear them saying there's just a few bad apples, and don't paint us with a broad brush. And I can almost hear their defensiveness of saying, I'm not a bad guy. I'm not bad. And how are we going to respond? Because they're fighting for their own identity. Talk about in our worth. And what are we? I mean, you almost can feel the panic inside the chest of some of the men that have worked so hard to be a good man. What would you say to them? And do you feel that same defensiveness?
Well, I think the defensiveness has to stop, because, I mean, if you look at the Me Too movement, and I mean, this is not just toxic masculinity. Some of this was abhorrent behavior by men. This is just unacceptable, criminal, abhorrent behavior. If you look at the inquiry that's done into the RCMP and the treatment of female officers in the RCMP, or the military for that matter, or, when you look at now we have a Nuns Too movement of the nuns that are abused by their male colleagues. You look at the Boy Scouts that went bankrupt because of the amount of abuse, and these are male-dominated organizations, institutions. Look at the amount of pedophilia that is perpetrated by men. So, I mean, if we've always looked at, we've looked at the trends to see where things go wrong. Well, the trends are pretty clear. It's something that we've done that's terribly wrong, that needs to be fixed. It's a public health crisis, I think.
Yeah, to add to that, one of the things that I think that's happened, I mean, since the Industrial Revolution, is we became objectified as human beings, right? When interchangeable parts came and the assembly line came, we became interchangeable people, and humans became objectified. And then when you have organizations like Anil's talking about, it's almost like we choose to give away our power as well to these organizations. And it's like, well, this is just what we do. And if we can really get back to the humanity of each person and come from this place of love versus fear, it's interesting in Anil's comment that he made previously about protection versus this nurturing. That's really what it is. Protection is a fear-based response, and nurturing is a love-based response. It's more of a feminine response. If we can choose to stand in our power and come from this place of love and treat humans as humans instead of, objects. I mean, if you look at, for example, the porn industry, it's all objectification. If you look at these instances of abuse, it's objectification of a human being. And that to me is super sad.
Mm-hmm. It is super sad, but it certainly challenges the image that we have of ourselves and of men. I mean, and it's certainly a systemic thing. I think it is a male problem. It's also a systemic issue that us men, I think, are the only ones that really need to talk to the men about it. That we need to be the one that's doing it. But we also, as we've already kind of circled around it, my goodness, have we failed our little boys.
Well, and I think, you make an important point. The men need to speak up, and we need to take carriage of this issue and speak up against each other. But I think it's equally important that this issue not be polarized like so much other stuff today into misogyny and misandry on the other end, because those are two extremes, and neither of those are helpful. And I think men really kind of need to open up to hear what women have to say. I think, that saying about behind every good man there's a great woman. Well, I think we need to look to women in leadership positions and women that are speaking up from that middle ground to say, okay, what is it that we can take away from this message? Because for us to listen to ourselves is going back again to defining things within our role model, our concept, our framework, which is what has fundamentally been wrong. So we've got to find a way to let women make that contribution in a way that we can embrace without going to those two polarized ends of this problem.
Certainly we need to, so what I'm hearing is that we need to learn to listen in a different way. We need to listen with our sense of calmness and our fears being weighed and being able to not be threatened. And so we kind of circle around, and I want to kind of go there at some point to talk about where do we get our power if we aren't going to get it through. We all need a sense of safety and security and love, as you say, it comes from love. And when the fight-flight response, the need for security is certainly basic to our humanity. It's hardwired in. And how is it that women get their security? And in contrast, now, can I ask a personal question? As a man, do you feel more powerful than a woman? Now, before I know the right answer, the politically correct answer, but is there any essence or sense that you can dig deep down and feel because I'm 6 foot whatever, or I'm strong, and I've always felt that? Do you ever feel that subtlety of being a little more powerful than a woman?
I think for me, it's comparing apples and oranges. And the reason I say that is because women have strengths that men will never have, and men have strengths that women will never have. And we're just different. And if we try and make us all the same, it's doing both sexes a disservice, I believe. One of the things that I really focus on with my clients is the concept of standing in your power, and where we give away our power. And you can stand in your power like a lion and be super, aggressive and alpha and everything else, or you can stand in your power like a mountain and just be strong and steadfast. And so I think trying to compare us men with women does both sexes a disservice, just because we're unique and we both have strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think part of this, the challenge, is trying to figure out what good masculinity is and what femininity is. It's not trying to make masculinity feminine and femininity masculinity. There's goodness in both, and we need to celebrate and combine those to make it better, not to diminish one. It's getting rid of the toxic parts of that. I've always been very proud to say I'm a feminist. I have 2 daughters, and I've always seen myself that way. But I'm realizing, as I speak to my younger daughter, who's at university and challenges me on almost everything in a good way, is that how can you say that? How can you say that you're a feminist? And my perspective as a guy on that term, it's all in the definition, is that I would not stand for another man to say something that's toxic to a woman without feeling like I need to intervene. Because if you look at the stats at university campuses, women are still by far disproportionately sexually assaulted. I think it's 54% of women will be sexually assaulted in colleges and campuses. We saw this protest at Western last week. 1 in 11 women across Canada are going to be sexually assaulted. And so that, when I say I'm a feminist, I'm in that war against that sort of injustice. Not saying that I understand, abortion rights issues or other women's issues that only a woman can truly, fully understand. So sometimes those definitions can get misconstrued and can be used against us without, while we're trying to find that middle ground of supporting each other.
Well, I agree. And the last thing we did, and we'll probably spend a whole episode on this in terms of the shaming of being a man, and what we don't need is to go the opposite reactionary extreme and begin to shame ourselves or feel bad about ourselves in that same. And I like that. We need to celebrate the both, but what we are really struggling with is, what does it look like and what is it defined as? And we seem to have a little bit of a picture. Randy is bringing in a lot of light and shining a lot of light on the metaphors of standing in your own power. But how do we get there? How do men go there and get there? And is any thoughts about where we need to do better? We there's a big gap between the start and the end.
It's interesting. I guess one of the questions that we can ask ourselves is, what are we fighting for? Because you never want to fight against something. Right. So if we're thinking about healthy masculinity, what does that look like? Right. The stats that Anil was giving as far as abuse to women, it breaks my heart. I mean, I have three daughters and 3 sons. And, to think about anything happening to my daughters, it breaks my heart. I think the first thing that we get to do as men is take 100% accountability for ourselves. If we can take accountability for ourselves and understand, which behavior works, which behavior, it's funny that the coined term toxic masculinity, but what it has to do with behavior, period. Whether you're a man, whether you're a woman, whatever. I do believe, by and large, men are good. Even though we've got the statistics that, that show all of this bad behavior, I do believe, by and large, men are good. But what I do believe is that there is a lot of programmed behavior based on our upbringing, right? If I came from an abused family and you came from a loving family, our view of love, period, is very, very different.
Right. And so I think that is a really important thing from my work, and uh, is bringing the connection then to, if we as men are struggling with who we are, and if things are shifting under us, it's quicksand, it's not solid ground, we're unsure of ourselves, we're afraid, and fear is very much part, and then the reactions of control, of etc. And it's requiring men to look inside. When we talk about the aggression of all the stats, we also can understand that another stat is that men are twice as likely to struggle with toxic anger. And so whenever we peel back the proverbial onion and talk about, well, what's that all about? What's going on in these men's lives and in their hearts and their souls and their thinking? I see suffering. I see men who are trying to be strong, but they're scared and they don't even know it, and it requires them to become vulnerable. And that is a hard thing to do.
Yeah, I think we sometimes look for easy and solutions that we can find, but it's such a complex issue. I mean, there's different layers. On the one layer, we have laws and we have regulations. We have outward norms that sort of define how men can and can't behave, what kind of jokes you can tell in public and can't. I had a gathering with a bunch of guys that I used to work with just a couple of weeks ago or last week. And so I was put on this group email. And I'm always hesitant of group emails. And so before this luncheon last week, some of the guys started sending out these jokes. And I found them inappropriate, especially given context of this conversation that we're having today. Become more sensitive to these things. And I struggled with that the week before that get-together, about how I was going to address this, how I was going to say that this is wrong. So there's the normative cultural rules sort of based approach where people start to change their behavior, so we see how people are behaving as being different. But this goes down to a deeper level. We need to change the culture about the values and norms that we have. We just need to know that that's wrong, not because somebody's going to hear it. It's just wrong to say that. It's just not right.
And talk about hard to do. We could talk about the strength of the thin blue line and inappropriate behavior, the things that's going on behind the closed doors or at the bar or whatever. And the humor is used significantly to deal with fear in policing and military. But to ever take a stand in the midst of all your buddies, talk about risking being shamed and being called a pussy and whatever, and that takes incredible courage to do.
And I think the trick is in trying to figure out when these type of situations present themselves, are you going to be an enabler or are you not going to be an enabler? And if you're not going to be, whether it's just getting up and saying, this isn't right for me, or, that's not right, or that bothers me, and walking away, or whatever it is, to set a tone, I think that's a responsibility that, is an individual responsibility.
Yeah, so, I mean, if you think about that, it goes back to taking unconditional accountability for your life. You don't do it because there's a law around it. You don't do it because of a social norm. It's just like, this is right and this is wrong. And it doesn't matter what anybody thinks or says. It's taking that accountability. I think one of the things that challenges us, which goes back to what you were talking about earlier, Kim, is the fact that a lot of us don't know how to deal with our emotions, right? And so having the emotional intelligence that when you get angry, it's just an emotion, and every emotion has a sponsoring thought. And if you're able to, navigate yourself through those things, then it doesn't create the behavior, right? If you have an emotion that comes up, you can attach to it, which amplifies it. You can act on it, or you can just let it go. And if you think about all the violence and all of that, and anything like any emotions like anger and guilt and shame and those lower type of vibrations, they're secondary emotions that come from fear. And so when we're playing in those areas, and those are the disempowering programs and the disempowering emotions that we have. So if we can take accountability for ourselves and our emotions and work through those, then I think that could shift the world like crazy, right? If you trigger me, it has nothing to do with you. It's a gift that I have that I get to work on something.
Absolutely. Yeah. In the George Floyd situation, the officer that had his knee on George Floyd, that was his character, that was his value, that he was executing what he believed in. The bigger problem were the officers that were standing around and observing that. Their values weren't strong enough inclined towards what the other officer was doing to jump on and add to that. So there was something holding them back. But their failure was even greater because they morally and ethically didn't intervene and enable that and didn't step in and say, enough, step back, I'll take over, or this is not necessary anymore. That's a huge failure. That's a huge cultural failure. One was just, clearly criminal and wrong and verges on evil. The other officers, what was going on that you did not feel that you could step up and say stop?
You're right. I mean, I would hope and I assume that a lot of policing and first responder cultures are asking themselves, is that the kind of culture we have created, that protectionism that no longer can identify wrong and right in those situations? And so we have to create men who find their strength in, it sounds a little mushy for us men, but in love. But you cannot love someone unless you've been loved, in my opinion.
Well, yes. And I mean, even those of us that have had trauma, and we've all had trauma, we learn to deal with it. I think the systemic part of this is also, we've always raised our boys learning to be part of a team. You got to be a team player. You got to be part of the team. You got to do but that creates groupthink. We've conditioned men to be able to think as a group. It's all about groupthink. Women, not so much so, I think, and I might be wrong on this. It's just sort of, I'm talking out the top of my head, but we need to teach men to be individuals, to be able to step aside and say, no, you know what, I'm part of the team, but I'm not part of the team.
Interesting.
And that's why we've got people in the priesthood, we've got people in the military, in the police forces, we've got people in, entertainment industry that are part of that group thing and feel safe doing whatever you say they're doing.
Well, and that's where they're giving away their power, because they're part of this group, and it's like it's almost like it makes it acceptable, right? For example, corporations that are spilling all kinds of nastiness into the water. As an individual, they wouldn't do that, but as a corporate, they do that. And so I do think that we give away our power within the group mentality as well. As far as your comment, Kim, is learning to come from a place of love. The thing that I have learned is we basically have love and fear as the primary motivators, and the Greeks had 6 different words for fear. Or 6 different words for love. And the highest version of that is agape love, which is an unconditional love. And it may or may not have an emotion with it, but it's where are you coming from? And so as an individual, and as a society, if we can learn to practice this unconditional love. And for me, whenever I talk about it, I don't even use the word love, just because your experience of love and my experience of love are completely different. And so what I have learned is agape love, unconditional love, is acceptance and understanding. And when we can come from a place of acceptance and understanding, then we become more complete humans. And we get to do that not only with other people, but with ourselves, right? We are all awesome people, and we are all assholes as well, right? And we get to accept that about ourselves, And when we can learn to do that and know that, we're doing the best that we can. We didn't come down here with manuals, and we're doing the best that we can. And a lot of bad behavior that we see in the world is learned behavior. It comes from trauma, like Anil was saying. And trauma, if you think about a 4-year-old child that's creating programming, PTSD can come because he pokes his head out to look for his mom, and his mom's not there, and he feels like he's abandoned, and she's just around the corner. But for us, as a 4-year-old kid, that creates trauma programming. And so I think just learning to come from this place of unconditional love. And it's interesting. You said, hey, we're men, we don't want to talk about mushy. That's programming right there, right? I mean, it's like, that's what we've learned growing up is, we're not supposed to show our emotions. We're not supposed to be vulnerable. And it's just a bunch of BS, because that is our humanness.
Well, and it's interesting because my sense is that while we are concerned about our behaviors, we need to begin to find the underpinning of what, like you said, the understanding. I like that aspect of love, but we need to. For me, I'm kind of principle driven, and what are the principles on which we will build our character, our systems, our etc. And what is leadership, and what does masculinity look like? And so when we talk about having corporations and leadership that is based on caring for the people, which is shifting, and we could even I could go on another tangent and talking about that we need to do that globally, not just as countries and as corporations. I mean, we can't tackle these massive issues when we're just talking about those kind of things. And I guess that's the whole part of human rights, etc., to raise and allow these values to rise to the top. But we do need to be able to hear and listen and respect each other and call out those who want to shame and blame the people that disagree with us, and be able to continue to offer that love. It's just that in my experience, that when we have not experienced love, it's very difficult to ever give it.
But, I think there's a momentum that's taking place, a much larger momentum, which is going to help carry us towards that direction. By that, I mean, we always talk about IQ. And 10 years ago, 15 years ago, this idea of EQ became very important. Now we talk about emotional intelligence, and that's becoming more mainstream in how we train leaders and corporations. We measured success by GDP. And now we've got countries starting to measure success by the happiness quotient. Right. It started in Bhutan, and now it's Britain and Australia and Canada. Everybody's using this concept. And so there's this movement from this ethic of protection and competition to this ethic of quality, of how we treat each other and who we are. And I think this whole movement, this men's movement, this male toxicity is going to be part of that. And we're going to be dragged along with this, which is a good thing.
Well, we might end up having to put, like we've done for cigarettes packages and warnings on this, or not allowing them to advertise to our young people, or not allowing the sugar pops in our schools because it's physically harmful. Maybe we need to be saying, they can't play all these war games, these boys, or they can't be shooting and killing these people. We are creating, we need to take responsibility on a global way of how we're training our kids. Just to make money is no longer acceptable. These are not where we want to go. This is not how we want to raise our men. And it could be a significant change in how we look at things. That seems like almost impossible to me for those kind of guidelines to take place, but we've seen it before. We've seen it with cigarettes. We've seen it with other things, and we need to be hopeful.
Well, could we have imagined a transgender athlete on an Olympic team 10, 15, 20 years ago? Could we have imagined a girl being a goalie on a men's hockey team 15, 20 years ago? So, I think the signals and the signs are there, but there's a hell of a lot more work to be done.
I think that's probably the best thing to be able to say. We have a long way to go. I like that whenever Randy reminded us that men aren't bad, we're good, and that but we are assholes sometimes, but we need to do better, and there's huge value and worth in every little boy and every toxic man. There's incredible worth and value, and our job is not just to call them out. Our hard job is to try to understand their experience and what they're going through, and be able to bring restoration and healing to them, because they have somehow been robbed of that for all kinds of reasons, probably. But our job is to, as you do, Randy, and is to empower and learn how to do that, and to be able to do it in non-punishing ways, but in mentoring ways is going to be our job. And I cannot help but think that as we learn to do that, we will become bigger men.
I think Randy's got, hits it right on the spot when he says it's about love and fear, because if we resort now to raising young boys with this notion that you're bad and everything that your gender has stood for is bad, we're just piling on a whole new set of trauma on them, which is going to create more dysfunctional men down the road. And so, we need to change that concept.
Well, and my experience is we're going through a societal shift. So one of the principles that I talk about a lot is this balance of love for self and love for others, right? And most of the time, a lot of people are like people pleasers, and so they give away their power because they're afraid of what other people think. They basically manipulate other people to get the response that they want. And so they don't love themselves enough. And so they're over on this victim kind of a side. And you don't know where that balance point is until you go over it. So I'll have clients and they'll start becoming selfish, which is awesome because they're not a victim anymore. And then they become like self-righteous, and it's like, oh, you need to do it like this. And they've gone overboard, but they don't know where the balance point is. And then they find their equilibrium. And I think as a society with women's rights and everything else, we're in the middle of that, right? Women are going through, and we will go overboard with women's rights and everything else until we find that balance that we need to have. And we're in the middle of it. And the last thing that we want to do, like Anil's talking about, the last thing we want to do is shame and guilt any masculine figure. And it's about loving yourself. It's about, standing in your power, and then having that balance of love for yourself and love for everybody else.
And holding those that are doing the wrong things accountable for what,
Yes.
It's not excusing anybody's behavior. It's just it's mitigating future dysfunction is the important part of it.
And just to kind of wrap it up, and I so appreciate the discussion, gentlemen, in therapy, but certainly in our own centers, we're so excited about training our children in neurological skill sets where we are literally tapping onto the detailed skills of managing emotions while connecting the physical of the body and the brain and the mind, and managing fear, rather and noticing it and becoming so titled and aware of when we are triggering the fight flight, that if we can do that with our children. My own grandsons absolutely love it because they have to manage on a hoverboard, they have to concentrate, they have to create some kind of emotional fear to allow that and then manage it and breathe it, and it's all through technology being read to the heart rate. And so they learn to manage their heart rate. They learn to manage it on very, very simple ways that is gamified. But we're doing better. That's the hope. We're doing so much better so that we can manage these very intense emotions that our bodies trigger, that are hardwired within us, so that we can begin to hopefully bring down a lot of this toxicity as well, that are, as you said, are secondary emotions to our fears. And so I think the horizon is very positive, but I do think we better put our seatbelts on, because change is happening and it's happening fast. And usually that creates reactions, and that's the only concern I have is the reactions, as you say, the pendulum goes. But we have no choice. We need to change, because it's, number one, it's the right thing to do, and we need to also work harder at saying, how can we do better? Because we can.
Amen.
Again, thank you, Randy and Neil. Thank you so much. I so appreciated this. I could go on forever kind of digging into some of your thoughts on some of this. But thank you, and I appreciate you volunteering your time for this, for men, for mental health, for making us better. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Appreciate it, gentlemen.